The winter of 1802. Along the banks of a river in Delaware, a man kneels beside cold water that moves without pause. The Brandywine. He is French, 30 years old, his hands still scarred from the workshops of Paris, from the laboratories where he learned to mix saltpeter and sulfur and charcoal into something that explodes. His name is Brandywine DuPont, and he has brought with him from France not just knowledge, but necessity. His family has fled revolution. They have left behind everything except what could be carried in trunks and now he stands on American soil, watching the river turn a wheel, watching the wheel turn possibility into motion, and he begins to build. The DuPont family's journey to America began in the chaos of revolutionary France. Luther's father, Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours, had been a prominent economist and statesman under the old regime, a physiocrat who believed that the wealth of nations flowed from the land and from the labor of those who worked it. He had advised kings and ministers, had helped negotiate the treaty that ended the American Revolution, had championed reforms that brought him both acclaim and suspicion. When the terror came, Pierre Samuel was arrested, and for a time, his family believed he would go to the guillotine like so many of his friends and colleagues. He survived, barely. Released after the fall of Robespierre, he tried to rebuild his life in France, but the country had changed, and he had become an anachronism. His sons, Victor and Luther, were young men with education and ambition, but no clear path forward in a nation exhausted by revolution and suspicious of anyone associated with old order. The family's printing business had been destroyed. Their investments had evaporated. They needed a new beginning, and America offered one. Pierre Samuel knew America. He had corresponded with Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. He believed that the young republic represented the future of human liberty, a place where Enlightenment principles might flourish without the bloodshed that had consumed France. In 1799, the DuPonts gathered what remained of their resources and booked passage across the Atlantic. They arrived in January 1800, refugees from one revolution landing in the capital of another. The site he has chosen is not beautiful in the way that painters seek beauty. It is practical. The Brandywine runs short and steep, which means power. Willow trees line the banks, and willows burn into the fine charcoal that gunpowder requires. The Delaware River is near enough to bring sulfur and saltpeter by ship. Stone quarries provide building material, everything needed to make black powder. The explosive that fires muskets and clears stumps and blasts rock from the earth exists within reach. For $6,740. Luther purchases 95 acres and a working dam. He names the place Eleutherian Mills after himself, after his father's ideals of liberty and enlightenment, after the hope that something might begin here that outlasts the terror they have escaped. The decision to manufacture gunpowder came from a chance observation. Luther, who had trained in the French gunpowder industry under the great chemist Lavoisier, went hunting with a friend shortly after arriving in the powder they used was of poor quality, inconsistent and weak compared to the French product. Luther remembered. He saw an opportunity. America needed good gunpowder, and he knew how to make it. With financial backing from France and the encouragement of Thomas Jefferson, who understood the strategic importance of gunpowder production, Luther laid the foundations for what would become one of the great fortunes in American history. The powder works opens in 1803. The first year produces 39,000 pounds of gunpowder. The second year, production triples. The federal government places orders. John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company becomes a regular customer. Hunters pushing west need powder. Farmers clearing forests need powder. The young republic is expanding. Expansion requires explosives. By the time Luther dies in 1834, 63 years of age, from causes that history does not clearly record, his mill has become the largest manufacturer of black powder in the States. More than 140 men work along the Brandywine. Over £1 million of powder leave the yards each year. The company carries debt, substantial debt accumulated through expansion and through the cost of caring for the families of workers killed in explosions, but the foundation has been laid. A business exists. A fortune is beginning to accumulate. A dynasty is taking shape. The question that will echo through 2 centuries has already been posed, though no one yet knows how to phrase it. What does it cost to build something that endures? And who, in the end, pays that cost? Luther understood danger. He had trained under Antoine Lavoisier, the French chemist who reorganized the Royal Gunpowder Administration before the Revolution claimed his head. Lavoisier taught his students that gunpowder manufacture be made safer through discipline, through routine, through the relentless application of science method. Luther carried these lessons to America. He built his mills with 3 walls of stone, thick and strong enough to enforce, 1 wall of light wood facing the river. When an accident occurred, and accidents always occurred, the explosion would blow outward, across the water, away from the other buildings and the workers and families who lived in the villages clustered along the Brandywine. Safety rules were strict. Machinist lamps were encased in glass to prevent sparks. Workers' boots were held together with wooden pegs, not metal nails that might strike stone and ignite powder. Cart horses wore leather covers on their hooves. A notice posted on New Year's Day of 1811 forbade all play or disorderly conduct. The powder yards were not a place for light-heartedness. They were a place where precision kept men alive. Yet precision could not prevent everything. In June of 1815, the pounding mill exploded. 8 workers died. In 1818, a more massive explosion, attributed to a foreman who had been drinking, destroyed 5 mill buildings, killed 36 workers, and injured Luther's wife, Sophie. The accident shattered families. It shattered villages. It left widows and orphans who had no recourse, except the charity of the man who had built the mills that took their husbands and fathers. Luther established pensions. He carried the debt of those pensions for life. His sons carried the debt after him. The human cost of the gunpowder business was never invisible to DuPonts. They lived on the hill above the mills, close enough to hear the machines grinding, close enough to feel the ground shake when something went wrong. They attended funerals. They knew the names of the dead. Yet the business continued. The nation needed powder. The nation would always need powder. And the DuPonts were the ones who knew how to make it. The War of 1812 brought the company its first great boost. The American government, preparing to fight the British again, needed enormous quantities of powder, and DuPont was positioned to supply it. Sales surged. Profits accumulated. The debt that had weighed on Luther's shoulders began to lighten. The company emerged from the war larger and stronger than before. Its reputation established, its future seemingly assured. After Luther's death, his eldest son, Alfred Victor, took charge for a time, though his health was fragile and his attention divided by chemical research. The real power passed to Alfred's younger brother, Henry, who assumed leadership in 1850 and held it for nearly 4 decades. Henry DuPont was known as Boss Henry or the General, though his military rank Delaware militia rather than any battlefield. He was not a scientist like father or his brother. He was an administrator, a strategist, man who understood that the gunpowder business was not merely about chemistry, but about markets and competitors, careful accumulation of advantage. Under Henry, the company expanded its dominance. Production grew more efficient, costs fell, quality remained high. By 1881, the DuPont company controlled 85% of the explosives market. Henry did not achieve this through innovation alone. He achieved it through consolidation, through the acquisition of competitors, through agreements with rivals to divide territories and fix prices. The Gunpowder Trade Association, formed in 1872, brought together the major powder manufacturer cooperative arrangement that looked, to outside eyes, very much like a DuPont was the largest member, the leader, company that set the terms. The Civil War had been particularly profitable. Henry was a staunch Unionist, and he ensured that no DuPont powder reached the Confederacy. The Union Army, however, received all the powder it needed. Between 1/3 and half of the powder fired by Union soldiers came from the mills along the Brandywine. 4 million barrels passed through DuPont's yards during the war years. The family fortune grew. Henry's nephew, Lambert DuPont, was the chemist of the next generation. He developed a cheaper method of making black powder by substituting sodium nitrate, saltpeter. He understood that the future of explosives lay not in black powder and dynamite, the powerful new compound invented by Alfred Nobel. In 1880, Lambert founded his own company in New Jersey, the Riporno Chemical Company, specifically to produce dynamite for the mining and railroad industries that were transforming the American West. 4 years later, Lambert was dead, killed in an accidental explosion at his own factory. He was 52 years old. DuPont acquired Riporno after Lambert's death, incorporating his vision into their own product line. The pattern was established. Innovation, expansion, risk, and the ever-present possibility of sudden destruction. The DuPonts made their fortune from substances that could turn without warning into violence. They lived with that knowledge every day. By 1889, when Henry DuPont finally stepped down, the company was the undisputed leader of the explosives industry. But Henry had no son to succeed him. The presidency passed to Eugene DuPont, a competent administrator, but not a forceful leader. Under Eugene, the company maintained its position without substantially advancing. Growth slowed. Energy waned. The dynasty seemed to be reaching the point that dynasties so often reach, a moment when the founding generation's drive dissipates, heirs struggle to find their own purpose. Then Eugene died. The year was 1902. A century had passed since Luther knelt beside the Brandywine. The surviving partners, elderly men who had known the company in its heroic age, decided to sell. They approached their competitors at Laughlin and Rand, the only firm large enough to absorb DuPont's assets. The family business, a century of labor and risk and accumulation, would pass into outside hands, or so it seemed. 3 young cousins intervened. Alfred I. DuPont, Thomas Coleman DuPont, and Pierre Samuel DuPont were all great-grandsons of the founder. All were in their 30s or early 40s. All had been educated at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, trained in engineering and chemistry and the methods of modern business. They had worked in various capacities within the company and beyond. They understood what DuPont was worth, and they were unwilling to let it go. Alfred was the powder man, one who had worked his way up from the bottom of the operation, driving wagons and fixing charges, until he knew black powder as thoroughly as his great-grandfather had. Thomas Coleman was the promoter, the deal-maker, the one with the grandest ambitions, the smoothest manner. Here was the financier, careful accountant, one who understood balance sheets and return on investment and the flow of capital through complex organizations. Together, they offered to buy the company from the senior partners for $12 million. They did not have $12 million in cash. What they had was the company itself, the assets and the name and the earning power, which they used as collateral to borrow what they needed. The deal closed in 1902. Yay! DuPont de Nemours and Company, founded by a French refugee with $6,000 and a willingness to have explosives, passed to a new generation of DuPonts who intended to transform it into something unprecedented. The transformation was rapid and systematic. Pierre had spent years studying management practices at a steel company partly owned by DuPont, learning techniques of organization and accounting that were being pioneered in American industry. He brought those techniques to Wilmington. The company centralized its research, establishing laboratories where scientists worked on improving existing products and developing new ones. It adopted modern cost accounting, tracking expenses and revenues with a precision that allowed managers to see exactly where money was made and where it was lost. The concept of return on investment, now fundamental to corporate finance, became a guiding principle of DuPont's decision-making. But the cousins did more than reorganize. They expanded. Between 1902 and 1907, DuPont acquired over 100 smaller powder companies, consolidating the explosives industry under a single roof. Many of these acquisitions were immediately closed, equipment scrapped, their workers dismissed. The goal was not to operate 100 small firms, but to eliminate competition and concentrate production in the most efficient facilities. Market share climbed. Profits climbed. The DuPont company, already dominant, became something approaching a monopoly. Such dominance attracted attention. In 1907, the federal government filed an antitrust suit against DuPont under the Sherman Act, charging that the company had combined with competitors to trade and fix prices. The case dragged through the courts for 5 years. In 1912, the ruling came down. DuPont and the Gunpowder Trade Association were declared an illegal monopoly. The company was ordered to divest portions of its business. The result was the creation of 2 new firms, Hercules Powder Company and Atlas Powder Company, carved from DuPont's holdings and set up as independent competitors. Yet even after divestiture, DuPont remained the largest manufacturer of Hercules powder, the modern propellant that had replaced black powder in military and sporting firearms. The antitrust action had trimmed the company, but not crippled it. The DuPonts retained their core business and their fortune. They had learned a lesson about government scrutiny, though whether they absorbed that lesson fully would become clear only later. What the cousins did not retain was their unity. By 1915, friction had developed between them. Thomas Coleman, whose health had failed, decided to sell his shares in the company. Pierre organized a group of investors, including some outsiders, to buy Coleman's stock. Alfred was not invited to participate. He was furious. He believed Pierre had maneuvered to exclude him, to concentrate power in his own hands, to betray the partnership that had saved the company from sale to outsiders just 13 years before. The conflict between Alfred and Pierre was more than a business dispute. It was a family rupture, those tensions simmering beneath the surface of DuPont unity. Alfred had always been different from his cousins. He was an engineer, a man who worked with his hands, who had learned the powder business from ground up by sweating alongside the workers in the yards. He was also partially deaf, the result of an accident, and his hearing loss had made him increasingly isolated and suspicious. He saw plots where others saw mere disagreements. He felt slighted when others felt nothing personal at all. Pierre was the opposite, smooth, diplomatic, patient. He built consensus where Alfred provoked conflict. He saw the company as a system to be managed, while Alfred saw it as a patrimony guarded. When Pierre excluded Alfred from the purchase of Coleman's shares, he may have done so for practical reasons, believing that Alfred's temperament would complicate the negotiations. But Alfred interpreted the exclusion as betrayal. and from betrayal there was no recovery. Alfred sued Peer for breach of trust. The case went to trial in 1916, in the midst of World War I, when the company was expanding at a frantic pace to meet Allied orders for explosives. The trial was bitter, the testimony damaging to both sides. Witnesses describe family meetings that descended into shouting matches, letters that dripped with accusation and resentment, partnership that hurtled into enmity. In the end, Peer won. The court ruled that he had acted within his legal rights, that Alfred's claims of fraud and conspiracy were unfounded. But the victory was hollow. The DuPont family was divided, perhaps permanently. The three cousins who had saved the company in 1902 would never work again. Alfred withdrew from active management of DuPont. He sold most of his shares and used the proceeds to build a new empire in Florida, acquiring banks and real estate and newspapers, establishing himself as one of the most powerful men in the South. He built Nemours, his mansion in Delaware, and lived there with his third wife, Bessie Wall, a woman half his age whom he had known since childhood. He remained wealthy and influential until his death in 1935, but he was no longer a DuPont in the way his cousins were DuPonts. He had been cast out, or had cast himself out, from family enterprise. The rupture with Alfred was the first serious crack in the DuPont edifice. It would not be the last. The forces that divided the cousins, personal and competing visions of how the company should be run, the difficulty of maintaining trust across generations, these forces would continue to work on the family in the decades to come. The DuPonts had built a great enterprise, but they had not found a way to ensure that future generations would work together as harmoniously as founders had worked. Meanwhile, the war in Europe was transforming the company that remained under Peer's control. Alfred sued Peer for breach of trust. The case went to trial. Peer won. The partnership was shattered. Alfred withdrew from active management, eventually leaving Delaware entirely to build a new empire in Florida real estate and banking. The DuPont family, which held together through a century of explosions and expansions and generation transitions, split along lines that would never fully heal. Peer became president of DuPont in 1915. He held the position through the years of World War I, when the company's fortunes expanded beyond anything the founders could have imagined. The war that began in Europe in 1914 created demand for explosives on a scale the world had never seen. Trench warfare consumed ammunition at staggering rates. Artillery barrages fired millions of shells. The armies of France and Britain needed powder, more powder than their own factories could use, and they turned to the neutral United States, where DuPont had the capacity and the expertise to. Peer and his brothers, IRN and Dammit, expanded production at a feverish pace. They built new plants, hired thousands of workers, and facilities around the clock. The company constructed a factory near Nashville, Tennessee, called Old Hickory, specifically to produce smokeless powder for the Allied forces. At its peak, the facility employed roughly 30,000 workers in a company town purpose-built to house. DuPont became the largest supplier of propellants to the Allies, providing 40% powder that fired their guns and shells. Nearly £1.5 billion of explosives left DuPont's factories during the war years. The profits were enormous. Annual earnings, which had been measured in single-digit millions before war, rose to $59 million per year. The company's revenues from powder and explosives soared from $25 million in 1914 to $319 million by 1918. Over the course of the war, DuPont generated well over $1 billion in sales from munitions alone. Such profits attracted criticism as well as envy. The term war profiteers began to circulate, applied to DuPont and other firms that had grown rich from the slaughter in Europe. Critics charged that industrialists like DuPont's had actively lobbied for American entry into the war. They had placed profit ahead of human life. They had benefited keenly from a catastrophe that killed millions. The accusation stuck. Whether they were fair is a question that historians continue to debate. What is not debatable is that the war transformed the DuPont family from wealthy to extraordinarily wealthy, from powerful to extraordinarily powerful. The criticism would intensify in the decades following the war's end. In 1934 and 1935, a Senate committee chaired by Gerald Nye of North Dakota investigated the munitions industry, seeking evidence that arms manufacturers had influenced American foreign policy in ways that led to unnecessary wars. The Nye committee summoned DuPont executives to testify, examined company records, and publicized findings that suggested the family had profited extravagantly from bloodshed in Europe. Newspapers ran stories describing the DuPonts as merchants of death, a phrase that captured the public's suspicion of industries that profited from human suffering. The family defended itself vigorously, arguing that it had simply responded to legitimate government orders and its products had helped the Allies prevail against German aggression. The defense was technically accurate, but emotionally unsatisfying. The image of the DuPonts counting their millions while young men died in trenches proved difficult to dispel. Yet the war profits, however controversial, created opportunities that the DuPonts were determined to exploit. The question became what to do with the money. Pierre and his advisors, particularly his secretary John J. Raskob, understood that the explosives business, while profitable, was cyclical and dangerous. Was created to demand. Peace suppressed it. A company dependent on gunpowder would boom in wartime and struggle in peacetime. Moreover, the risks of manufacture remained. Explosions still killed workers. Public hostility toward munitions makers was growing. The DuPonts needed to diversify, to invest their war profits in industries that did not carry the stigma and instability of weapons production. Raskob proposed an answer. Automobiles. The automobile industry was young and growing rapidly. Henry Ford had demonstrated that cars could be produced cheaply enough for ordinary Americans. Roads were being paved. Gasoline was abundant. The market seemed poised for explosive growth, and DuPont had to participate. In 1914, Deere began purchasing stock in General Motors, then a struggling collection of automobile brands assembled by the promoter William C. Durant. Deere joined GM's board of directors in 1915. The DuPont company itself invested $25 million in GM stock, an enormous commitment at the time. By 1919, DuPont controlled 27% of General Motors. Raskob left DuPont to become chairman of GM's finance committee. When GM nearly collapsed during the post-war recession of 1920, DuPont stepped in as president to save it. The rescue of General Motors was one of the most consequential interventions in business history. Durant had assembled GM through a frenzy of acquisitions, buying up automobile makers and suppliers with little regard for how the pieces fit together. The company was disorganized, undercapitalized, and hemorrhaging money. Its stock price had collapsed. Creditors were pressing for payment. Without outside assistance, GM would have failed, and the American automobile industry would have developed along very different lines. He brought to GM the same organizational genius that transformed DuPont. He recruited professional managers, established accounting controls, and created the divisional structure that would become the model for large American corporations. He worked closely with Alfred P. Sloan Jr., a former supplier who understood both the automobile business and the principles of management. Together, Pierre and Sloan rebuilt GM from the ground up, developing the strategy that would make General Motors the dominant force in American manufacturing the next half-century. Rather than compete with Ford on price, GM would offer consumers a range of vehicles at different price points, from the affordable Chevrolet to the luxurious Cadillac. Each division would target a specific market segment, and customers would be encouraged to move up through the brands as their incomes increased. The phrase "a car for every purse and purpose" captured the vision. The strategy worked brilliantly. By the mid-1920s, GM had surpassed Ford as the largest automobile manufacturer. Under Pierre's leadership, General Motors was reorganized. Management was professionalized. The company's sprawling divisions were brought under coordinated control. Alfred P. Sloan Jr., who had come to GM through an acquisition, developed the organizational structures and market segmentation strategy. GM, the largest automobile company in the world. By the time Pierre retired from GM's board in 1929, the company had surpassed Ford and stood atop the global industry. The DuPont's relationship with GM was synergistic in ways that went beyond stock ownership. DuPont sold General Motors paint, antifreeze, leather substitutes, upholstery, and numerous other products. GM was a captive customer, purchasing from its largest shareholder. The arrangement was profitable for DuPont and convenient for GM, but it also raised questions. Was this a natural business relationship, or was it a form of self-dealing that disadvantaged other suppliers and harmed competition? The question would return, with consequences decades later. In the meantime, the DuPonts were diversifying DuPont itself. The company that had made gunpowder for a century was becoming a chemical company, a materials science company, a corporation at the forefront of industrial research. The shift began during the war years, when DuPont established two of the first industrial research laboratories in the United States. The goal was to apply scientific methods to the development of new products, moving beyond explosives in paints, lacquers, and synthetic materials. After the war, this research accelerated. DuPont acquired companies in related fields, entered joint ventures with foreign firms, and poured money into laboratories where chemists explored the frontiers of organic chemistry. The decade of the 1920s was a period of prosperity and expansion for the DuPonts. The war profits had been invested wisely. The General Motors stake was generating both dividends and capital gains. The chemical business was growing, driven by new products and markets. The family's wealth continued to compound, creating fortunes that would sustain descendants for generations. Yet there were shadows beneath the prosperity. The concentration of economic power in the hands of a few families troubled democratic critics who believed that such concentration was incompatible with principled society. The DuPonts were not just wealthy. They were influential in ways that extended far beyond their business operations. They funded political candidates and causes, supported institutions that promoted their views, and used their economic power to shape public policy in ways that would later attract scrutiny and resistance. The results were remarkable. In 1920, DuPont formed a joint venture with a French company to produce artificial silk, which came to be known as rayon. In 1924, DuPont began manufacturing synthetic ammonia. In the late 1920s, the company acquired rights to cellophane, a thin, transparent film that would revolutionize packaging. Each acquisition, each joint venture, each research initiative expanded the company's scope and reduced its dependence on the volatile explosives market. But the most significant advances came from a young chemist named Wallace Carruthers. Carruthers was hired by DuPont in 1928 as part of a new research initiative by Charles Stein, the director of DuPont's chemical department. Stein had persuaded the company's executives to fund a program of pure science, basic research into the nature of polymers without any obvious immediate application. The idea was radical for American industry at the time. Most corporate research focused on solving immediate problems or improving existing products. Stein proposed research aimed at discovering fundamental knowledge, trusting that practical applications would eventually follow. Carruthers was brilliant, troubled, and ambitious. He believed that polymers, giant molecules that form the building blocks of materials like rubber and silk, could be synthesized in laboratories through ordinary chemical reactions. This was a controversial view. Most scientists at the time believed polymers were simply aggregates of smaller molecules, held together by mysterious forces that defied conventional chemistry. Carruthers set out to prove them wrong. He succeeded. In 1930, his research group produced two breakthrough materials. The first was neoprene, a synthetic rubber that was resistant to heat, oil, and chemicals. The second was a polyester fiber that could be drawn into strong, elastic threads. The polyester was not commercially viable because it melted at low temperatures, but it demonstrated that synthetic fibers could be. The path was clear. Over the next 5 years, Carruthers and his team refined their methods, tested hundreds of chemical combinations, and searched for a fiber that combined strength, elasticity, and heat resistance. On February 28, 1935, succeeded. A polyamide compound, synthesized from hexamethylene diamine and adipic acid, could be drawn into filaments strong, flexible, and durable. DuPont named it nylon. Nylon was announced to the public in 1938 at the New York World's Fair, where it was billed as the first completely synthetic textile fiber. The material was described as derived from coal, water, and air, a miracle of modern chemistry. Women lined up to buy nylon stockings, which were smoother, stronger, and more sheer than silk. In its first year of commercial production, DuPont sold 64 million pairs of nylon stockings. The fiber soon found applications in toothbrushes, parachutes, ropes, and countless other products. Nylon became DuPont's most profitable invention, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue over the following decades. Carruthers did not live to see nylon's triumph. Depressed and alcoholic, he took his own life in April 1937, a year before the public announcement. He was 41 years old. The inventor of the miracle fiber died before the miracle entered the world. The success of nylon confirmed the value of fundamental research. DuPont expanded its laboratories, hired more scientists, and launched new investigations into polymers, plastics, and synthetic material. In 1938, a researcher named Roy Plunkett accidentally discovered a slippery white substance while working on refrigerants. It was polytetrafluorethene, later marketed as Teflon. In 1965, Stephanie Kwolek developed a rigid polymer fiber that was 5 times stronger than steel by weight. It was called Kevlar, and it would save countless lives as the material of bulletproof vests. The commercial success of nylon was interrupted by the Second World War. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States suddenly faced the loss of its supply of silk from Asia. Silk had been essential for parachutes, and parachutes had become essential for modern warfare. The military needed an alternative, and nylon provided it. DuPont converted its nylon production from consumer goods to military supplies, churning out parachute fabric and wire cords and countless other applications that supported the war effort. The company's contribution to World War II extended far beyond nylon. DuPont was selected by the federal government to design, build, and operate the Hanford Engineer Works in one of the key facilities in the Manhattan Project that developed the atomic bomb. The plutonium production plant at Hanford was an engineering challenge of unprecedented scale and complexity. DuPont's experience in large-scale chemical manufacturing, its culture of safety, and its willingness to take on difficult projects made it the natural choice for the task. The DuPonts approached the Manhattan Project with some reluctance. They remembered the accusations of war profiteering that followed the First World War. High committee hearings, the image of merchants of death that had attached itself to munitions makers. They feared that participation in a secret weapons program would invite similar criticism, particularly if the weapon proved as devastating as scientists predicted. Ultimately, the company agreed to participate, but only on condition that it would receive no profit from the work. DuPont built Hanford for a fee of $1, covering its costs but refusing any margin. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war and inaugurated the age. DuPont's role in their creation was both a source of pride and a burden of risk. The company had helped win the war, but it had also helped unleash a force that would shadow human civilization for decades. The DuPonts never fully reconciled themselves to the moral ambiguity of their contribution. They had done what their government asked, what the necessities of war demanded. Whether that was enough to justify the means remained a question that history would continue to debate. After the war, the DuPont returned to civilian production with a pent-up demand for consumer goods that had been unavailable during years of rationing. Nylon stockings, which had disappeared from store shelves after Pearl Harbor, reappeared in 1945 and caused new riots among women eager to replace their worn-out wartime hosiery. The company could not produce enough to meet demand. Lines formed outside stores hours before openings. Police were called to control crowds. The nylon shortages of the immediate post-war period entered American folklore as evidence of both the material deprivations of wartime and the consumer hunger that would drive the post-war economic boom. The boom was good for DuPont. The company expanded into new markets, developed new products, and rode the wave of prosperity that lifted the American economy through the 1950s and 1960 seconds. Suburbs spread across the landscape, filled with houses built with DuPont materials, furnished with DuPont fabrics, equipped with appliances and plastics. The company's products became so pervasive that many Americans encountered DuPont dozens of times daily without ever thinking about it. The DuPonts had transformed their company from a manufacturer of explosives into a fountain of a source of materials that reshaped daily life across the globe. The family fortune, built on gunpowder and fertilized by war, now rested on foundations of chemistry and science. Yet even as the company grew more sophisticated, the family's control was beginning to erode. The transition was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. Ed DuPont had retired from the presidency of DuPont in 1919, handing the role to his brother IRNE. IRNE served until 1926, when he was succeeded by Lambert DuPont II, eighth consecutive family member at the company. Lambert guided DuPont through the Great Depression, maintaining profitability by cutting costs and continuing to invest in research. He also organized political opposition to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, which DuPont feared would impose excessive regulations on business. The American Liberty League, funded substantially by DuPont money, became a vehicle for this mission, though its efforts ultimately failed to prevent the expansion of federal power. Lambert served until 1940, when he was succeeded by Walter Carpenter Jr. Carpenter was not a DuPont by blood. He was a career executive who had risen through the company's ranks over decades of service. His appointment marked a significant shift. For the first time in the company's history, the chief executive was not a member of the family. The shift was pragmatic rather than ideological. The DuPont family remained the largest single block of shareholders. Family members continued to serve on the board of directors and to hold senior positions throughout the company. But the operational leadership had passed to professional managers, been chosen for their competence rather than their ancestry. The pattern would continue. After Carpenter came Crawford Greenwald, an engineer who had married into the DuPont family, made his career on merit. After Greenwald came Lambert DuPont Copeland, another family member, who served from 1962 to 1967. Then, in 1967, came Charles McCoy, another non-family executive. And then came Irving Shapiro. Shapiro was unlike any previous leader of DuPont. He was a lawyer, not a chemist or engineer. He was Jewish, son of Lithuanian immigrants, raised in Minneapolis, father who worked as a tailor and dry cleaner. He had no connection to Delaware society, no education and no family ties. He had joined the company in 1951 as a young attorney in the legal department, and he had risen because he was smart, capable, and willing to take on difficult assignments. One of those assignments was the antitrust case that would reshape the DuPont family's relationship with General Motors. The case had its origins in 1949, when the Justice Department filed suit against DuPont, alleging that the company's ownership of GM stock violated the Clayton antitrust. The government argued that DuPont's controlling interest in GM had allowed it to dominate the market for automotive finishes and fabrics, cutting out competitors, restraining trade. The DuPonts believed the charges were groundless. General Motors bought DuPont products because they were good products, not because of stock ownership. The relationship was commercial, not coercive. The case went to trial in Federal District Court in Chicago. DuPont won. The judge ruled that the government had failed to prove its case, but the Justice Department appealed, and in June 1957, the Supreme Court reversed the lower court's decision. In a 4-2 ruling, the court found that DuPont's ownership of GM stock had indeed tended to create a monopoly and violated federal antitrust law. The company was ordered to divest its shares. The ruling was a shock. No antitrust case since the breakup of Standard Oil in 1911 had involved interests of such magnitude. DuPont owned 23% of General Motors, the largest automobile company in the world. Divesting those shares would be an operation of unprecedented complexity, affecting shareholders, tax obligations, and market stability. Irving Shapiro played a central role in managing the divestiture. The process took years. It required acts of Congress to address tax implications. It demanded careful coordination with regulators, investment bankers, and the courts. By the time the divestiture was complete in 1962, DuPont had transferred its GM shares to its own shareholders, severing the tie that had bound the two companies for nearly half a century. The DuPont family still owned stock in both companies, but the institutional link, the relationship that Pierre DuPont had forged in the 1910s and General Motors' market for DuPont products. The family's power over the automobile industry had been broken by the federal government. Shapiro continued to rise at DuPont. In 1973, he was appointed chairman and chief executive officer, first lawyer, and one of the first outsiders to hold the position. His appointment marked the end of an era. The DuPont family no longer controlled their own company. They remained shareholders, directors, and beneficiaries, but the levers of daily management had passed permanently in national hands. Under Shapiro, DuPont faced a difficult decade. The 1970s brought oil shocks, recession, environmental regulation, and declining demand for textile fibers, which had become a mainstay of business. Profits fell. The stock stagnated. Shapiro cut research spending, sold unprofitable divisions, and worked to reduce the company's dependence on cyclical industries. He also arranged the merger of Christiana Securities, the DuPont family's holding company, into DuPont itself, consolidating ownership and simplifying the corporate structure. Shapiro retired in 1981. He was succeeded by Edward Jefferson, another professional manager, who embarked on an ambitious strategy of diversification. Jefferson's boldest move was the acquisition of Conoco, the second largest domestic oil producer, in 1981. The deal was worth nearly $8 billion, the largest merger in American history at the time. Jefferson believed that owning an oil company would give DuPont secure access to petroleum feedstocks, the raw materials from which plastics and synthetic fibers were made. He was also responding to the oil crises of the 70s, which had exposed the vulnerability of companies dependent on volatile commodity markets. The Conoco acquisition was contested. Other suitors, including Mobil and Seagram, launched competing bids. Battle became one of the messiest takeover fights in American corporate history, involving hostile offers, defensive maneuvers, and fierce negotiations. DuPont prevailed, but at a cost. The company took on substantial debt. The integration of two very different corporate cultures proved difficult, and the anticipated synergies between chemicals and oil never fully materialized. By the 1990s, the strategic logic of the Conoco acquisition had faded. DuPont sold the oil company in 1999, spinning it off as an independent firm. The grand plan to integrate raw materials and finished products had come to nothing. The company that had made its fortune from gunpowder and nylon found itself restructuring, investing, and searching for a new identity. The DuPont family watched from the sidelines. They still owned stock. They still sat on boards. But the decisions that shaped the company were made by executives or no family connect, by boards that answered to institutional shareholders' pressures rather than to dynastic continuity. The transformation that Pierre DuPont had set in motion a century earlier, the professionalization of management, had reached its logical conclusion. The family that founded the company no longer ran it. The final chapters unfolded in the 21st century. In 2015, DuPont found itself under pressure from activist investors. Hedge funds that had accumulated significant stock positions demanded changes in strategy and leadership. Nelson Peltz, one of the most aggressive activists, launched a proxy fight to place his nominees on the company's board. CEO Erland Kuhlman resisted. The battle was bruising, expensive, close. Kuhlman won the proxy vote, barely, but resigned within months. The company she had led was wounded. The proxy fight with Peltz marked a turning point in DuPont's history. For decades, the company had operated largely free from the scrutiny that activist investors brought to bear on other corporations. The DuPont family's shareholding, though no longer controlling, had provided a buffer against aggressive outsiders. Professional management had run the company according to strategies that prioritized long-term research and development over short-term earnings growth. The culture was deliberate, patient, scientific. It was not the culture that hedge fund managers appreciated. Peltz and his Triumph partners demanded that DuPont cut costs, improve margins, and return more cash to shareholders. They argued that the company was bloated and underperforming, that management had grown complacent, that the board lacked the independence to challenge executives who were coasting on past achievements. The accusations stuck because some of them contained elements of truth. DuPont had indeed struggled to match the performance of its peers. Its stock had lagged the market for years. The diversification strategies of earlier decades used a sprawling conglomerate that was difficult to manage and impossible to value. The proxy contest consumed management attention for months. DuPont spent millions on lawyers and public relations advisors. Executives who should have been developing new products and managing operations were instead defending their records in presentations to shareholders and journalists. When the votes were counted, DuPont had won, but by the narrowest of margins. More than 40% of shareholders had voted for Peltz's nomination. A stunning rebuke to management, a warning that the company's trajectory was unsustainable. Kuhlman resigned in October 2015. Her successor, Edward Breen, had a different mandate and a different temperament. Breen was a turnaround specialist CEO who had built Tyco International after it nearly collapsed in an accounting scandal. He was not sentimental about corporate history or family legacies. He was focused on creating shareholder value. He believed that the best way to do so was through radical restructuring. What followed was the end of DuPont as an independent entity. In December 2015, DuPont announced a merger with Dow Chemical Company. The combined firm, called Dow DuPont, would be worth an estimated $130 billion. The plan called for the merged company to eventually split into 3 separate entities, each focused on a different sector: agriculture, material science, and specialty products. The DuPont name would survive in one of the 3, but the company itself, the firm that Luther had founded on the Brandywine in 1802, would cease to exist as a coherent whole. The merger was presented as a partnership of equals, a strategic combination that would create synergies and efficiencies available to either company alone. The reality was more complex. Dow and DuPont had been competitors for generations, with different cultures, histories, different ways of doing business. Merging them required painful choices about which executives would stay and which would go, which research programs would continue and which would be shut down, traditions would be preserved and which would be abandoned. For the DuPont family, the merger represented the final surrender of any meaningful connection to the company their ancestors had built. They would receive shares in Dow DuPont, later in the 3 successor companies. But those shares would carry no special status, no family boards, no influence over strategy or management. The DuPonts would become ordinary shareholders, indistinguishable from pension funds and mutual funds that own the majority of corporate equity. The merger closed in August 2017. Dow DuPont became the largest chemical company in the world. Within 18 months, the promised spin-offs were complete. The agricultural division became Corteva. The material science division became the new Dow. The specialty products division retained the DuPont name. 215 years after Luther Ray DuPont built his first gunpowder mill, the company he created was divided and dispersed. The family fortune, once concentrated in a single enterprise, was scattered across 3 firms, countless investment portfolios. The family itself, which numbered more than 3,500 living descendants as 2016, held an estimated $14 billion in wealth, but few of them bore any active role in the businesses their ancestors. The estates remained. Winterthur, the Museum of American Decorative Art. Longwood Gardens, with its 1,000 acres of fountains and flowers. Nemours, the mansion Alfred built for his second wife. Hagley, the site of the original powder mills, preserved as a museum of industrial history. These places endured as monuments to a dynasty that had shaped American industry and let it slip away. What endured also was question. What did it cost to build something that lasted to centuries? What was the price of wealth accumulated through explosives and war profits, through monopoly and antitrust, through chemistry that created miracle chemistry that poisoned workers and polluted rivers. The DuPonts had made their fortune in substances that killed and substances spawned. They had employed tens of thousands of workers and eliminated tens of thousands of jobs through consolidation and automation. They had funded schools and hospitals and museums, and they had funded political movements to resist labor rights and social welfare. The environmental legacy was particularly troubling. By the late 20th century, evidence had accumulated that some of DuPont's products and manufacturing processes caused serious harm to workers, and PFAS chemicals developed by DuPont and used in countless consumer products had contaminated water supplies and been linked to cancer and other diseases. Lawsuits accumulated. Settlements were paid. The company that had marketed itself as bringing better things for better living was forced to reckon with the costs that progress had imposed on people who never shared in the profits. The ledger does not balance easily. Perhaps it cannot balance at all. Perhaps the only honest accounting is to say that the DuPonts were a family like other families, motivated by ambition and fear and love and pride, who happened to possess the knowledge and capital to build one of the great industrial enterprises of the modern world. They held that enterprise for 5 generations, passing it from father to son and cousin to cousin, adapting to wars and depressions and technological revolutions, until the scale of the enterprise outgrew the capacity of any family to control it. The professionalization of management, the dispersion of ownership, intervention of government, demands of shareholders, the logic of global capital, all these forces conspire to break the grip of the founding family. The DuPonts did not lose their company through incompetence or scandal, though there was enough of both along the way. They lost it because the world changed, because the structures they had built became too large and too complex for family governance, because the very success they achieved made family control an anachronism. The Brandywine still flows through Delaware, past the ruins of the old powder yards, past the museums and gardens and memorials. The water turns no wheels now. The machines are silent. The DuPonts are dispersed, most of them unknown to one another. Their wealth divided among so many heirs that no single branch commands the fortune that Luthray began to accumulate centuries ago. What remains is a name, applied to companies that the family no longer governs. What remains is memory, preserved in archives and histories, and the physical fabric of estates maintained by trusts and foundations. What remains is the question that haunted Luthray as he knelt beside the cold river and wondered whether anything he built could last. The answer, as it turns out, is both yes and no. Something lasted. The fortune, diminished by division, but still substantial, persists. The products, nylon and Teflon and Kevlar and 100 others, persist in daily life around the world. The influence, less direct than it once was, but still measurable, persists in the economics of Delaware and the culture of American industry. But the control is gone. The dynasty has ended. The family that once commanded an empire now watches from a distance as others determine the fate of what their ancestors made. This is the story of how the DuPont family lost control of its industrial empire. It is also the story of how all family empires eventually end, not with a single catastrophe, but with the slow accumulation of forces that no family, however determined, can indefinitely. Powder yards are quiet now. The river runs on. Time continues its patient work, erosion and transformation, wearing away what seemed permanent, revealing what lies beneath. The DuPonts built something remarkable, and then, like everyone else, they had to let it go. Perhaps that is the final lesson of any dynasty. Wealth can be accumulated, power can be consolidated, names can be inscribed in stone and bronze, and the records of history. But nothing lasts forever. The question is not whether control will be lost, but how and when, and what will remain after the loss is complete. For the DuPonts, what remains is considerable. Their name is still spoken. Their products are still used. Their estates are still visited by thousands of people each year, who come to see the gardens and the mansions and the powder mills where a French refugee began building something that is more than most families can claim. That is, perhaps, enough. The story does not end here. Stories never really end. Somewhere, at this moment, descendants of Luthray and DuPont are living their lives, inheriting portions of the fortune, carrying the name in various spellings and stylings, connected by blood to the man who knelt beside the Brandywine and decided to make something out of water and willows and the knowledge he had carried from France. They are lawyers and doctors and artists and business people who have never thought much about their ancestry. They are part of a lineage that stretches back through 2 centuries of American history and depressions and technological revolutions, through triumphs and tragedies, the quiet daily work of maintaining what has been built. The company their ancestors founded has been divided into pieces. The control their ancestors exercised has been dissolved. The coherence their ancestors maintained The sense of a single family guiding a single enterprise through the generations has fragmented beyond recovery. This is what happens. This is what always happens. Empires rise and empires fall. Only question is how long the interval between rising and falling can be stretched. The DuPont stretched it for 200 years. They outlasted most of their competitors, most of their rivals, most of the other families who tried to build dynasties in American industry. They survived antitrust action, world wars, and the Great Depression, and the transformation of the American economy from manufacturing to services to information. They adapted and evolved and clung to what they had built until the forces of change became irresistible. And then they let go. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, gradually, incrementally. There was decades of transition that moved so slowly that no single day could be identified as the day the dynasty ended. The ending was diffuse, like the ending of a river into a delta, spreading into countless channels that eventually disappear into the sea. The sea, in this case, is the vast impersonal ocean of global capital, where ownership is dispersed among millions of shareholders, where control is exercised by professional managers who boards that are in no family, however wealthy, can maintain the kind of concentrated power that the DuPonts once wielded. This is the world we live in now. It is a world that DuPonts helped create through their investments in General Motors and their pioneering of modern corporate management, their transformation of a family business into a publicly traded multinational corporation. They built the mechanisms of their own obsolescence. They professionalized the management that would eventually displace them. They diversified the ownership that would eventually dilute their control. They created the conditions in which family dynasties could no longer survive, even as they fought to maintain their own dynasty against. This is the irony at the heart of the DuPont story. The family's greatest achievements, the transformation of a powder mill into a global chemical company, application of science management to industrial organization, creation of research laboratories, invented material the world had never seen. These achievements made it impossible for the family to remain. The company became too large, too complex, too integrated into the global economy for any single family to govern. Success bred the seeds of succession. Perhaps Luthor understood this in some inchoate way, as he watched the water turn the wheel on the Brandywine. Perhaps he knew that whatever he built would eventually pass out of his family, that the work of one generation could not bind the generations that followed. Perhaps he built anyway, knowing that the building itself was the point, that the pleasure and the purpose lay in the making rather than the holding. Or perhaps he did not think about such things at all. Perhaps he was simply a man with a skill and an opportunity, doing what he knew how to do, hoping that he would out, trusting that his sons and their sons would figure out the rest. Perhaps the grand narrative of dynasty and decline is something we impose afterward, a story we tell to make sense of what was, in the living of it, just one day following another, one decision following another, one generation following another until the accumulated weight of time became too heavy to carry. Powder yards are quiet now. The mansions are museums. The gardens bloom for visitors who pay admission and walk the paths that DuPont feet once walked. The family is dispersed, its fortune divided, its control surrendered, its story becoming history. But the river still runs, the water still turns, and somewhere, perhaps, someone is kneeling beside a cold stream, thinking about what might be built, what might endure, what might outlast a single human life. The DuPonts are not the first to ask such questions, and they will not be the last. The dynasty has ended, but the questions remain, as eternal as the water that flows through Delaware toward the sea. This is how it ends, not with a bang, not with a whimper, but with a gradual loosening of the grip, slow recognition that what was held can no longer be held, a final acceptance that time has come to let go. The DuPonts have let go. The company continues without them. The world continues without them. And the story, like all stories, moves on to other families, other empires, other dreams of permanence and legacy that will, in their turn, dissolve into the stream of time. The Brandywine flows on. The DuPonts are part of its history, part of the sediment that lines its banks, part of the memory that the water carries as it moves toward destinations unknown. They built something remarkable. They held it as long as they could, and then they let it go. This is the way of all things. This is the story of how the DuPont family lost control of its industrial empire. It is also, in the end, the story of everything that is built and everything that passes away. The powder yards are silent. The water moves without pause. And somewhere, in the archives and the museums and the fading memories of a family dispersed across 3,500 lives, the echo of what built continues to resonate, fainter each year, never quite disappearing. Not yet. Not entirely. Not while someone, somewhere, remembers the name. DuPont. The name lingers. The empire is gone, and the river, as always, flows on. But to understand truly what was lost, one must return again to what was built. The scale of the DuPont achievement cannot be measured simply in dollars or in the number of generations that held control. It must be measured in the transformation of American industry itself, in the methods and DuPont's pioneered and that spread throughout the corporate world, in the very conception of what a business enterprise is. When Luther Ray DuPont arrived in America in 1800, the idea of a corporation was still primitive. Businesses were typically partnerships or sole proprietorships, dependent on the personal involvement of their owners, limited in scale by the capital that the family could accumulate. The great enterprises of the age were trading companies and banks, institutions that handled money rather than made things. Manufacturing was conducted in small workshops, often attached to the homes of the craftsmen who created them. The factory system, which would transform the economies of Europe and America over the following century, was only beginning to emerge. The DuPonts were part of that emergence. The powder works on the Brandywine was not a workshop but an industrial operation, employing dozens and eventually hundreds of workers, requiring capital investment far beyond what any single craftsman could provide. It demanded organization, management, coordination of labor and materials on a scale that most American businesses had never attempted. The DuPonts learned to operate at this scale through trial and error, through the accumulated experience of generations, through the painful lessons taught erosions and market collapses and labor disputes. By the time Pierre DuPont and his cousins took control in 1902, the company had developed management techniques that were among the most sophisticated in American industry. He refined and systematized these techniques, drawing on his experience at the Johnson Company Steel Works and on the emerging field of science management that Frederick Taylor and others were pioneering. He created organizational charts that mapped the flow of authority, and he established accounting systems that tracked costs and revenues with unprecedented. He instituted the return on investment metric as a tool for evaluating business decisions, allowing managers to compare disparate operations on a common basis and allocate capital where it would generate the highest returns. These innovations spread beyond DuPont. Alfred Sloan, who learned at Pierre DuPont's side during the reorganization of General Motors, carried the methods into the automobile industry and beyond. The multi-divisional corporate structure, in which a central headquarters oversees semi-autonomous operating divisions, became the standard form of large American corporations. The concept of decentralized operations with centralized financial control shaped the development of companies from General Electric, Procter & Gamble. The DuPont system of management became, in effect, the template for modern corporate organization. This was a legacy that outlasted family control. Long after the last DuPont CEO retired, long after the company merged with DOW and fragmented into pieces, the organizational forms that Pierre and his colleagues developed continued to govern American business. Every Fortune 500 company, in some measure, traces its structural DNA to the innovations pioneered on the banks of the Brandywine. The research laboratory was another DuPont contribution to American industry. Before DuPont established its experimental stations, corporate research was rare and narrowly focused. Companies solved immediate problems and improved existing products, but few invested in fundamental science with no guaranteed practical application. The DuPonts changed that calculus. They hired university-trained chemists and gave them resources to investigate basic questions about the nature of matter. They trusted that new knowledge would eventually yield new products, even if the path from discovery to application was unclear. This trust was vindicated again and again. Nylon emerged from Wallace Carither's investigations into polymer chemistry. Neoprene came from the same research program. Teflon was discovered by accident in a laboratory searching for new refrigerants. Kevlar arose from experiments in liquid crystalline polymers. Each breakthrough created new markets, new industries, new applications that transformed daily life. The model of fundamental research funded by corporate profits became standard practice throughout American industry, spawning the great research laboratories of Bell Labs and IBM and Xerox PR. The DuPonts did not invent corporate research, but they proved its value on a scale that convinced other companies to follow. The American chemical industry, which by mid-century dominated the world, was built largely on the DuPont model. The petrochemical plants and pharmaceutical laboratories and material science facilities that got the American landscape spirit, if not in law, of the experimental stations that Stein persuaded the DuPont to fund in the 1920s. Yet even as the DuPonts shaped American industry was shaping them. The forces that would eventually break their control were embedded in the very success they achieved. The professionalization of management created a class of executives whose loyalty was to their careers rather than to any particular family. The growth of stock markets created mechanisms for dispersing ownership among millions of shareholders. The expansion of government regulation created external constraints on corporate behavior that family could evade or control. The antitrust laws were particularly significant. The Sherman Act and the Clayton Act, passed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, expressed a democratic suspicion of concentrated economic power. The DuPonts ran afoul of these laws repeatedly, from the Gunpowder Trust case of 1907 to General Motors' divestiture of the 50s. Each encounter taught the same lesson. No family, however powerful, could indefinitely maintain monopoly control over American market. The government would intervene. The courts would order divestiture. The accumulated advantages of scale and integration would be stripped away. The DuPonts adapted to these constraints, but adaptation meant dilution of control. The consent decrees and court orders that ended various antitrust actions required changes in corporate structure, the sale of subsidiaries, the opening of markets to competitors. Each change reduced a family's ability to command the enterprise as their ancestors had commanded it. The gunpowder monopoly was broken in 1912. The General Motors connection was severed in 1962. Piece by piece, the empire was dismantled by the very government Lutheran had once supplied with powder. The 20th century also brought changes in the broader economy that worked against family dynasties. The rise of institutional investors, pension funds, and mutual funds and insurance companies managing billions of dollars, concentrated share ownership in professional hands that had no sentimental families. The growth of global competition exposed American companies to pressures from foreign rivals with different cost structures and different capabilities. The acceleration of technological change shortened product life cycle and made accumulated expertise less valuable than adaptive agility. The DuPonts faced all these pressures. Their textile business, which had seemed so promising in the years after nylon's introduction, gradually declined as foreign producers captured market share with lower labor costs. Their chemical business, once the most innovative in the world, fell behind European and Japanese competitors who invested more heavily in research and development. Their attempts at diversification, the acquisition of Conoco and forays into pharmaceuticals and technology, produced mixed results that did not fundamentally alter the company's trajectory. By the 1990s, DuPont was no longer the dominant force in American industry had been at mid-century. The company remained large and profitable, but it was one among many competing in markets where family heritage conferred no particular advantage. The DuPont name, which had once commanded automatic respect in the corridors of power, became merely a brand, a marketing asset that belonged to shareholders rather than to blood descendants. The final loss of control came not through hostile takeover or government act, but through the impersonal logic of corporate combination. The merger with DOW Chemical in 2017 was presented as a partnership of equals, a strategic response to industry consolidation and competitive pressure. But for the DuPonts, it was the end of something that had begun 2 centuries earlier. Dissolution of an enterprise that had borne their name and answered to their direction since before the War of 1812. The family accepted the merger because they had no practical alternative. The shareholders who held voting power saw value in combination in the synergies and cost savings that the merged entity promised. The directors who governed the company believed that size and scale were necessary survival in a consolidating industry. The DuPonts, reduced by generations of minority stakes, could not muster the votes to resist even if they had wished to. And perhaps they did not wish to resist. Perhaps they understood, ancestors had understood in different circumstances, that adaptation was necessary for survival. The DuPonts had sold land and factories and subsidiaries before. They had merged holding companies and spun off divisions. They had transformed their business from gunpowder to dynamite, chemicals to synthetic material. Change was not alien to the family tradition. Change was the family tradition. What was different about the DOW merger was its finality. Previous transformations had preserved the DuPont identity, the corporate structure that traced its lineage back to Lutheran's mill on the Brandywine. The merger dissolved that structure. The company that emerged was something new. Something that owed as much to Herbert DOW's chemical empire in Michigan as to the DuPont inheritance in Delaware. The name survived in one of the successor companies, but the continuity was severed. This is what it means to lose control of a family enterprise. Not a single dramatic moment of defeat, but a gradual erosion of influence, a slow transfer of power from descendants to shareholders, professional managers to impersonal forces of global capital. The DuPonts did not surrender their company. They watched it evolve beyond their capacity to govern, watched it become something larger and more complex than any family could direct, watched it finally merge into the anonymous flow of corporate combination that characterizes modern business. The pattern is not unique to the DuPonts. It is the common fate of family dynasties in American industry. The Rockefellers lost Standard Oil to antitrust action. The Fords ceded control of their automobile company to professional managers. The Carnegies sold their steel empire to JSB Morgan. The Vanderbilts, who once commanded the greatest fortune in America, saw their wealth dissipate across generations until their name became historical rather than current. What distinguishes the DuPonts is the length of their tenure and the scope of their achievement. 2 centuries of continuous operation, through wars and depressions and technological revolutions, through antitrust actions and family feuds, and the death of heirs, represents an extraordinary persistence of control. The innovations they pioneered in management and research and industrial organization shaped the development of American capitalism. Their products, from gunpowder to nylon to Kevlar, changed the material conditions of life for billions of people. This is a legacy worth remembering, even as the control that created it passes away. The DuPonts were not perfect stewards of their enterprise. They made mistakes, pursued dead ends, mistreated workers, polluted environments, and accumulated wealth in ways that critics found troubling. They were, in short, human beings operating within the constraints and opportunities of their time, neither heroes nor villains, but participants in a complex historical process that no single family could fully comprehend or control. The process continues. The companies that emerged from the Dow-DuPont merger continue to operate, continue to employ thousands of workers, continue to produce chemicals and materials that enter the stream of global commerce. The DuPont name appears on products and buildings and foundations and hospitals and schools. The family's wealth, though divided among thousands of descendants, remains substantial by any ordinary measure. The estates along the Brandywine attract visitors who come to see what the DuPonts built and to wonder at the scale of their ambition. But the control is gone. The dynasty has ended. And the question that began this narrative, question that haunted Luther as he watched the water turn the wheel, remains unanswered. What does it cost to build something that endures? The DuPonts paid that cost in labor and risk and the blood of workers killed in explosions. They paid it in family feuds and antitrust suits and the gradual erosion of their influence. They paid it in the final dissolution of the enterprise they had built. Was it worth it? The question cannot be answered objectively. Worth depends on values, on what one believes matters in the span of human existence. The DuPonts accumulated wealth beyond the dreams of ordinary families. They shaped industries that transformed the world. They left monuments of beauty and institutions of learning that will outlast any corporation. They also contributed to wars and environmental damage and the concentration of economic power that troubled democratic critics. The ledger is mixed, as all ledgers are. What is clear is that the DuPonts tried. They tried to build something lasting, something that would bear their name and serve their descendants and contribute to the world in which they live. They succeeded for 2 centuries. And then, like all who try, they reach the limits of what trying can achieve. The Brandywine flows on, indifferent to the human dramas enacted along its banks. The powder yards have fallen silent. The mansions have become museums. The family is dispersed across a continent, connected by blood and name, but no longer by common enterprise. The great industrial empire that Luther founded and Henry expanded and transformed has dissolved into the currents of global capital, leaving behind traces and the perpetual question of all meant. Perhaps the meaning lies in the attempt itself. Perhaps the value of a dynasty is not in its permanence, but in its persistence, in the generations of aimed something against forces of decay and change. The DuPonts persisted longer than most. They held on longer than they had any right to expect, and when they finally let go, left behind a legacy that used to shape the world even as the family that fades into history. This is the story of how the DuPont family lost control of its industrial empire. It is also a meditation on what control means, on what can be built and what must eventually be surrendered, on the limits of human ambition in the face of time and change. The DuPonts are not the last word on these questions. They are one chapter in a larger story that humanity continues to write, a story of aspiration and achievement and inevitable decline that will again and again, in different forms and different names, as long as people continue to build and to dream. The powder yards are silent now. The water moves without pause. The dynasty has ended, and somewhere, at this very moment, another family is beginning the work that will, in time, create another empire, a legacy, another story of rise and fall that will echo down the generations until it too dissolves into the stream of history. This is how it has always been. This is how it will always be. The DuPonts are part of that eternal pattern now, their story complete, their control surrendered, their place in history secure. They built something remarkable. They held it as long as they could. And then, like everyone before them and everyone who will come after, they let it go. The river runs on. The name endures. And the question of what it all meant remains, always, for those who come after to consider and debate and ultimately to answer for themselves. The estates that remain tell part of the story. Winterthur, the great house that Henry Francis DuPont filled with American decorative art, stands as a monument to the family's taste and their commitment to preserving the material culture of their adopted country. The collection numbers nearly 90,000 objects, displayed in period room settings that recreate the homes of colonial and early American families. Visitors walk through rooms transplanted from historic houses across the eastern seaboard, each piece of furniture and wallpaper and silver carefully chosen to represent the craftsmanship era. Henry Francis, son of Henry Elgin and DuPont, who was himself the son of Henry DuPont, the general who had led the company through the Civil War years. 3 generations of Henrys, each devoted in his own way to accumulation and preservation. Henry Francis began collecting as a young man, after visiting an exhibition of American furniture that opened his eyes to the beauty and historical significance of long been dismissed, essential and unsophisticated. He spent the next half-century acquiring furniture, textiles, ceramics, paintings, and metalwork, transforming his family home into a museum that would, after his death, become one of the premier collections of its kind in the world. The impulse to collect and preserve ran through the DuPont family like a genetic trait. Pierre Samuel DuPont, the visionary who reorganized the company and saved General Motors, created Longwood Gardens, more than 1,000 acres horticultural display featuring fountains and conservatories, outdoor gardens that attract visitors from around the globe. Pierre had purchased the property in 1906 to save an arboretum of old-growth trees being sold to a lumber company. Over the following decades, he transformed the site into a masterpiece of landscape design, drawing on his travels in Europe and his deep personal interest in horticulture. The DuPonts were gardeners as well as industrialists. They had brought from France a love of plants and designed landscapes that persisted across generations. The formal gardens of their estates reflected both European traditions and American adaptations, a blend of influences that mirrored the family's own hybrid identity. They were French by origin, but American by allegiance, cosmopolitan in their tastes, but rooted in the particular landscape of Brandywine Valley. Alfred I. DuPont, the powder man who had worked his way up from the bottom of the company and then quarreled bitterly with his cousin Pierre, built Nemours, a mansion modelled on the French stoves of his ancestors. The house sprawls across 77 rooms, surrounded by gardens inspired by Versailles and filled with European antiques, works of art. Alfred had been partially deaf since a gunpowder accident in youth, and the estate included a carillon of bells whose music he could feel even when he could not fully hear it. After Alfred's death, his estate funded the Nemours Foundation, which established hospitals and healthcare services for children. The mansion itself became a museum, open to visitors who come to see the opulence that old money could create in early 20th century America. Irony is not lost on thoughtful observers. Alfred made his fortune from explosives that killed and maimed. His foundation treats children injured by accident and disease. The ledger balances or does not balance, depending on how one weighs the credits and debits. Hagley Museum and Library preserves the site where it all began, powder yards on the Brandywine where Luther built first mills and where generations of DuPonts lived, worked and died. The stone buildings, restored and interpreted, show visitors how gunpowder was made in the 19th century. The mill race still channels water from the river. The machines, reconstructed from historical records, demonstrate the processes that transformed raw materials into explosive power. The Hagley Library holds the DuPont family archives. Hundreds of thousands of documents trace the business and personal lives of centuries. Scholars come to read the letters and ledgers, to piece together the story of a family that shaped American industry and American society in ways that are still being understood. The records are detailed and extensive, product of a family that kept careful track of its affairs and preserved its papers for posterity. These estates and archives constitute one form of legacy, a physical and documentary record that will persist long after the family's control of its company has faded from memory. The DuPonts built their monuments and endowed their foundations, ensuring that their name would remain attached to institutions of beauty and learning and charitable purpose. This is what wealthy families do when they can no longer control the enterprises that made them wealthy. They transform economic capital into cultural capital, exchanging power over markets for influence over museums and universities and hospitals. The DuPonts have been particularly successful at this transformation. The institutions they created and funded are among the finest of their kind. The gardens and mansions attract hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. The libraries and archives support scholarly research into history, business history, and material culture. The hospitals treat children who would otherwise lack access to care. This is a legacy that endures independently of corporate control, a contribution to society that does not depend on the family's continued ability to run a chemical company. Yet it is not the legacy that Luther envisioned when he knelt beside the Brandywine. He built a business, not a museum. He wanted to create something that would employ his descendants and generate wealth for his family, and produce products that the world needed. The transformation of that business into cultural institutions represents a kind of failure, however graceful. The DuPonts could not hold onto what they had built. They could only convert it into forms that no longer required their active management. This is the final irony of the DuPont story. The family succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation, building an industrial empire that lasted 2 centuries and generated wealth beyond calculation. And then they had to let it go, had to watch as the enterprise they created passed into hands that bore no family connection, had to content themselves with museums and gardens, and the fading memory of a time when the DuPont name commanded not just respect but power. The transition was not sudden or dramatic. It unfolded across decades through the gradual professionalization of management, the slow dispersion of ownership, and the inevitable erosion of family influence in the face of market forces. The DuPonts did not lose their company in a hostile takeover or bankruptcy proceeding. They lost it through the normal operation of this. They had helped to create a system of professional management and public ownership and corporate governance that defines modern American capitalism. This is, perhaps, the most significant lesson of the DuPont story. The forces that concentrate wealth and power in family hands are eventually overcome by the forces that disperse them. No dynasty lasts forever. No family can indefinitely maintain control over an enterprise that grows beyond a certain scale and complexity. The DuPonts held on longer than most, but in the end, they too succumbed to the logic of modern capitalism, which rewards efficiency over loyalty and adapts management to circumstance rather than preserving it for heirs. The family remains wealthy. The $14 billion estimated in 2016, spread across more than 3,500 living descendants, represents a substantial fortune by any ordinary measure. Many DuPonts continue to live comfortably in the Brandywine Valley, connected by blood and tradition to the land where their ancestors built their mills. Some work in professions that have nothing to do with chemistry or industry. Others pursue philanthropic interests or manage family trusts. A few have achieved distinction in politics or business or the arts, but they no longer control the company that bears their name. They no longer command the resources that Luther, Ray, and Henry and Pierre assembled. They are inheritors of legacy, not makers of a future. The dynamic energy built the powder mills and transformed the American explosives into modern management techniques, dissipated across generations, diluted by division, and diffused by the sheer number of descendants and family wealth must be shared. This is the arithmetic of inheritance. What is concentrated in one generation is divided in the next, divided again generation after. Less new wealth is created to replace what is distributed. Each descendant receives less than the generation before. The DuPonts created enormous wealth, more than enough to sustain their descendants in comfort for generations to come. But they could not create enough to maintain concentrated control over an enterprise that required billions of dollars in capital to compete in global markets. The loss of control was not a failure of character or intelligence. It was a mathematical inevitability, a result of the same inheritance laws and family structures that affect all dynasties. The DuPonts did everything that could reasonably have been expected of them. They trained their heirs in the business. They created holding companies to concentrate family shareholdings. They maintained traditions of service and obligation that kept successive generations engaged with the family enterprise. None of it was enough. The forces arrayed against family control were simply too powerful. The growth of the company required capital that no family could provide from its own resources. The professionalization of management required expertise that family members could not always supply. The regulation of markets required adaptation to rules that favored competition over consolidation. The globalization of industry required operations on a scale that many families could supervise. The DuPonts adapted as best they could. Adaptation meant dilution. Each professional manager hired, each share sold to outside investors, each consent decree signed with government regulators reduced the family's grip on its enterprise. The adaptations that allowed the company to survive and grow were the same adaptations that transferred control from the founding family to the impersonal forces of capitalism. This is the tragedy, if it can be called a tragedy, of the DuPont story. The family's success created the conditions for its own displacement. The empire they built became too large for them to govern. The innovations they pioneered made family control obsolete. The wealth they accumulated was dispersed by the same mechanisms that had allowed them to accumulate it in the first place. Perhaps tragedy is the wrong word. Perhaps the DuPont story is not a tragedy, but a natural history, a chronicle of growth and maturation and eventual decline that follows patterns as predictable as all living things are born, grow, mature, and eventually die. Why should family enterprises be any different? The DuPonts were born on the banks of the Brandywine in 1802. They grew through the 19th century, surviving explosions and wars and economic depressions. They matured in the 20th century, achieving a scale and sophistication that made them one of the great industrial enterprises in the modern world. And then, in the 21st century, they reached the end of their natural lifespan, merging into a larger entity and surrendering the identity that had distinguished them for 200 years. This is not a story of failure. It is a story of completion. The DuPonts fulfilled their purpose. They built something remarkable and sustained it for as long as human effort could sustain it. And then, when the time came, they let it go, making way for whatever comes next in the endless cycle of creation and destruction drives economic progress. Powder yards are silent now. The water moves without pause. The dynasty has ended, and somewhere in Delaware, the descendants of Luther, Ray, and DuPont continue their lives, carrying a name that once commanded an empire, and now merely recalls one. They are part of history now, their ancestors' achievements inscribed in the record of American industry, their own futures unwritten and uncertain. The Brandywine flows on. The story is told, and the question of what it all meant remains, as it always does, for those who come after to ponder how the DuPont family lost control of its industrial empire. That is the question this narrative has explored. The answer lies not in a single event or a single decision, the accumulation of 2 centuries of history, in the pressures and opportunities and constraints that shaped each generation's choices, inexorable logic of growth and change that transforms all human institutions over time. The DuPonts were remarkable, their achievements were extraordinary, their persistence was exceptional, and in the end, they too succumbed to the forces that consume all dynasties, leaving behind a legacy that both celebrates and questions the very concept of family control in modern capitalism. The Brandywine flows on. The story is told, and the silence of the powder yards speaks more eloquently than any words about what remains when empires pass away. The name persists. DuPont, spoken now by strangers who never knew the family, printed on products developed by scientists, no connection. Delaware, attached to a corporate entity, traces its origins as much to Michigan as the Brandywine. The name has become a brand, a marketing asset, a legal designation of the personal meaning it once carried. And yet, the name still echoes in the halls of Winterthur, in the gardens of Longwood, and the archives of Hackley. It still appears on the maps of Delaware, attached to highways and schools and hospitals and parks. It still carries weight in certain circles, still commands recognition among those who study American history or American industry or the fate of great families in democratic society. The DuPonts are not forgotten. They are remembered, perhaps not as vividly as they were remembered when the family still commanded its empire, but remembered nonetheless. Their story is told in books and documentaries and museum exhibitions. Their contributions to American life are studied and debated and assessed. Their example serves as both inspiration and warning to families who aspire to build something that will outlast them. What lesson do the DuPonts offer? Perhaps it is simply this, that nothing lasts forever, that every empire ends. The wisest course for those who build is to build with an awareness of impermanence, creating value that will persist even after all has passed away. The DuPonts created such value. The products they developed, the management techniques they pioneered, the research methods they established, cultural institutions these contributions continue to shape American life long after the family's control of its company has ended. The DuPont legacy is not merely a matter of shareholdings and board seats. It is embedded in the fabric of American industry and American culture, a permanent addition to the national inheritance. Consider what the world would look like without the DuPont contributions. No nylon, therefore no stockings that last, no parachutes that open reliably, no bristles on your no Teflon, and therefore no non-stick pans, no Gore-Tex jackets, no wire insulation in countless electronic devices, no Kevlar, and therefore no bulletproof vests protecting police officers and soldiers, no cut-resistant gloves in factories and kitchens. The materials that the DuPont laboratories invented are woven so thoroughly into life that their absence is almost impossible to imagine. Consider also the organizational innovations, the multi-divisional corporate structure, the concept of return on investment as a management tool, the industrial research laboratory dedicated to fundamental science. These ideas, pioneered at DuPont and spread by Pierre DuPont and Alfred Sloan through General Motors, and became the standard forms of American corporate organization. Every large company today operates according to principles DuPonts helped establish. The invisible architecture of modern capitalism bears their fingerprints. And consider the cultural institutions. Winterthur preserves the material culture of early America for future generations. Longwood Gardens demonstrates the possibilities of horticultural art on a scale rarely attempted. Hackley Museum tells the story of American industrialization through artifacts and archives of DuPont Powder Works. These places attract visitors from around the world, educating and inspiring those who come to see what the DuPonts built. This is what remains when empires pass away. Not the power itself, which is always temporary, but the effects of that power. Changes wrought in the world by those who once commanded resources, directed them toward particular ends. The DuPonts changed the world. The world will not forget them. The family itself continues, scattered across the country, connected by blood and name, but no longer by common enterprise. The descendants of Luth, Ray, and DuPont pursue their individual lives and careers. Some are wealthy, beneficiaries of trusts established by ancestors they never knew. Some are comfortable, but not extraordinary, their share of the family fortune diluted by generations of division. Some have abandoned the DuPont name entirely, preferring anonymity to the weight of a legacy they never saw. They are lawyers and doctors and teachers and business people, no different in their lives from millions of other Americans in accident. A few have achieved distinction in their own right. Pete DuPont served as governor of Delaware and sought the Republican presidential nomination in 1988. Others have contributed to philanthropy, to conservation, to the arts, but none has attempted to rebuild the industrial empire that their ancestors created. The era of family dynasties in business has passed, and the DuPonts have accepted their place in history rather than struggling against it. The Brandywine flows on. Powder yards are silent. The dynasty has ended, but the legacy endures, written in stone and steel and the synthetic fibers that clothe the world, written in the organizational structures of modern corporations, research laboratories of industry, written in the gardens and museums and hospitals bear the DuPont name. This is what it means to build something that lasts, not to hold it forever. Nothing can be held forever, but to leave behind a mark, a trace, a contribution that persists after the builders themselves have gone. The DuPonts left such a mark. They built their empire, and they lost it, but what they built while they held it continues to shape the world. This is their story, complete now, part of history, available for those who wish to learn from it. How the DuPont family lost control of its industrial empire, and how, even in losing, they left behind a legacy that transcends the loss. The river flows on. The name endures. The story is told, and somewhere, perhaps, in a laboratory or a workshop or a quiet room where ideas take shape, another person is beginning the work that will, generations, create another fortune, another dynasty, another story of rise and fall that future historians will tell. The DuPonts are not the last of their kind. They are simply one example, one illustration, one data point, endless human experiment of building and passing on and eventually surrendering what has been built. The questions they granted remain. How do families maintain unity across generations? How do enterprises adapt to changing circumstances without losing their identity? How do dynasties transfer power from founders to heirs to professional managers without destroying what made them special in the first place? The DuPonts answered these questions as best they could, and their answers worked for 100 years. That is an extraordinary achievement, worthy of study and respect, even as we recognize the limitations and failures that accompanied it. Powder yards are silent now. The water moves without pause. The dynasty has ended, and the story, like all stories, continues in the lives of those who come after, who inherit not just wealth and name, but the accumulated wisdom of all who have tried before them to build something that lasts. This is the story of how the DuPont family lost control of its industrial empire. It is also a meditation on time and change, ambition and acceptance, and the eternal human desire to create permanent in a world where nothing is permanent. The DuPonts are gone from the company they founded, but the company continues in altered form, bearing their name, and the world they helped shape continues around it, transformed by their contributions, touched by their presence, remembering their story. The Brandywine flows on, toward the Delaware, toward the sea, toward destinations unknown. The DuPonts have joined the river of history now, their portion of the journey complete. What comes next is for others to determine. The name endures. The legacy persists. The story is told.